All right, so our new quarter, which will be taught not by me, but Aaron Holiday, but which I will try to begin for him. We're going to be studying the divided kingdom on Wednesdays. That means we're going to be studying the book of First and Second Kings, and we'll be studying from Chronicles as well. And I thought to begin this, we should look at the verse kind of where the divided kingdom really begins. So if you want to go ahead and open your Bibles, you can open to 1 Kings chapter 11. And I'll read from here in just a moment, beginning in verse 11. But what we see here is sort of the end of the reign of Solomon, who we know is the last king of Israel's united kingdom. And starting in verse 11, we see how this is all going to come to an end. So this is 1 Kings 11, verse 11. It says, "Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, since this has been your practice, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I've commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. Yet for the sake of David your father, I will not do it in your days, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away all the kingdom, but I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of David, my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem that I have chosen." All right, so here God clearly seems to be displeased, unhappy with Solomon. He tells him, "You have not kept my covenant and my statutes." And God's solution for this is he's going to tear the kingdom. He says he's going to tear it from Solomon, and he's going to give the kingdom to his servant. And what he tells him, and in fact, he's going to give almost the entirety of the kingdom. Although he says not all, he says for the sake of David and for the sake of Jerusalem that he's chosen, that Solomon and David's line will retain one tribe. So here he talks about just a single one. He seems to be lumping in Judah as well as Benjamin. I don't know if that's because at this time Benjamin had sort of all but assimilated into Judah, but the emphasis is on the 10 tribes that are going to be torn away and put in the hands of his servant. So if you're Solomon, then you might be asking, how did I get here? How did I get to this point? And so Aaron has very kindly left me some slides as well as his notes, and so we're gonna talk for just a moment about how did we get here? Okay, so here we were earlier, just in Mark, at the end of Mark, but we are focusing on this period in here, and so here we are in Kings. Most of this period from here is the divided kingdom. At the beginning, we have Saul becomes the first king of a united kingdom of Israel, and this goes until 586 BC, which is one of the common accepted dates for the exile to Babylon, so the Babylonian captivity. And so we're going to be studying here in this period of time, which again means we're going to be studying in First and Second Kings. We'll be in Chronicles. When you think about these parts of the Old Testament, what kind of teaching is there? So how? I guess the point I'm trying to make is this is told to us very much like the gospel accounts in stories. So it's narrative, prose, it's history. There's some poetry in here. There are some speeches, but for the most part, we're learning through stories when we read here. The themes that we're going to cover. So one, we just sort of heard in God's speech to Solomon, one of the themes that's going to carry throughout, especially in the discussion of the kings of Judah, is God's promise that he's going to carry on David's line. We talked about this in the Mark class. You can look in 2 Samuel 7. God makes a promise to David that a king will sit on his throne forever. And so much of what we read here in the divided kingdom period is God keeping this promise to keep that line of Davidic kings alive. But we also have themes of covenant unfaithfulness. So repeatedly, kings are judged on the extent to which they keep the covenant with God the way David did. Um, and then along with this covenant unfaithfulness, we're going to be introduced to the prophets. God is going to send prophets to Israel. He's going to send them to Israel and to Judah. And the message is going to be repent, return to the covenant faithfulness, turn back to the ways of David, turn away from the ways of Jeroboam. So the prophets are going to play an important role as well as the kings. And then ultimately, exile and Babylonian captivity as the consequence for Israel's idolatry, for their unfaithfulness, and even for their injustice in the way that they deal with others. There's going to be many kings that we're going to study about in the divided kingdom period. I think there's 20, and it'll cover roughly 20 kings from both Israel and Judah. And again, the author, as they write this, is going to judge each of these kings. It's almost a grading system at the end of these, where it's going to judge them according to whether did the king himself worship God and God alone? Did the king turn to other gods? Did the people turn to idolatry during the king's reign? And then lastly, have they remained faithful to the covenant? And so all of these are going to be assessed kind of along this rubric or this metric. And what we're going to find is all of the kings of Israel ultimately fail. They fail to live up to the purpose that God had for Israel's kings. The kings of Judah, most of them will not live up to this standard. Only a handful, maybe 8 or so, would you say, have met these criteria. But so again, so how did we get here? If we look at this chronology, what this is it goes all the way to the patriarchs. And of course, the first patriarch is Abraham. And it's at that point, through Abraham, that God basically creates a new people. He creates a people out of Abraham. And so then why? Why choose Abraham? For what purpose does God choose Abraham? And for what purpose does God make Israel? And so that's something we should look at. So I'm going to ask for a few volunteers to read. First reading, 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 23 and 24. If you'd like to, okay, so Brother Walton, if you can wait for the microphone, it'll be 2 Samuel 7, 23 and 24.
Second Samuel 7, 23 and 24. And who is like you, who is like your people Israel, the one nation on earth whom God went to redeem to be his people, making himself a name and doing for them great and awesome things by driving out before you your people whom you redeemed for yourself from Egypt, a nation and its gods. And you have established for yourself your people Israel to be your people forever. And you, O Lord, became their God.
Okay, so what this tells us in this passage is one of the purposes for Israel is to be God's people. It says they are to be his people forever, and he is to be their God. It says he made himself a name by creating them, by taking them out of Egypt and rescuing them in the fashion that he did. He redeemed them from Egypt and Egypt's false gods. All right, so the second reading will be from Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 6 through 8. Anyone want to get that? All right, Kurt. Deuteronomy 7, verses 6 through 8.
For you are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his own possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. The Lord did not set his love on you, nor choose you because you were more in number than any of the peoples, for you were the fewest of all peoples.
Oh, keep going, sorry, to verse 8.
But because the Lord loved you and kept the oath which he swore to your forefathers, the Lord brought you out of by a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt.
All right, thanks. Okay, so here we see that again, God has chosen Israel to be his treasured possession out of all the peoples on the face of the earth, he says. And it's in verse 7, he says it is not anything inherent in Israel and who they are as a people. He says it's not because you were more in number than any other people. That's not why it says the Lord set his love on you and chose you. It says, in fact, you were the opposite. You were the fewest of all people. But in verse 8, it tells us, because the Lord loves you and he's keeping the oath that he swore to your fathers. So again, this takes us back to Abraham. And this will be another scripture reading for us. So someone will read Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3. Cole's got it up here.
All right. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3.
Yes.
All right. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great. And you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. And in all the families of the earth you shall be blessed."
All right, so right here, did you catch it? God actually states his purpose for blessing Abraham and for creating this nation. And what is his purpose that he states here to Abraham? Right, that I will bless you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So God here is blessing the one for the many. He's creating out of the one, or out of the few, Israel, to be a blessing for all the families of the earth. So God has a purpose then, out of that he expects from Israel. He has a purpose that he expects from his people. And I think what we saw with Solomon is that Israel, at the end of Solomon's reign, was no longer fulfilling the purpose that God intended for Israel. Again, we talked about some of that in Mark, even if you think back to remember how Jesus sort of acted out this parable of the fig tree, where he goes to the fig tree and he's looking for fruit, and there is no fruit. And so ultimately he curses he curses the tree, and it withers and dies. And that's a sort of an acted out parable, sort of representing Jesus going to Jerusalem and going to the temple and finding no fruit. So again, this is, God has a purpose. He has expectations for what Israel should be. And part of the reason we have a divided kingdom, or the reason, is because it wasn't fulfilling God's purpose. Just going to advance through some of these slides here. All right, so again, this kind of focuses in on the period that we'll be looking at. All right, so why study all of this? So why is it important to learn, I guess, from the Old Testament, learn from the mistakes of Solomon, learn from the mistakes of these kings that we read about in Israel and Judah? Well, we have some verses from the New Testament that talk about the usefulness of the Old Testament, the Old Testament scriptures. And part of those scriptures is what we're going to be learning about. So we can look in Galatians and see that the law in the Old Testament has become our tutor to lead us to Christ, so that we might be justified in our faith. 1 Corinthians 10, verses 11 says, "Now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction." Romans 15, "For whatever was written in earlier times was written for our instruction." So here we have Paul telling us how these stories, even though they're old, even though they oftentimes deal with failures, what they're here for is for instructions for us. These people we read about in the Old Testament, they may not be our direct ancestors, but they are our spiritual ancestors, because as the church is the spiritual Israel, the new people created out of Abraham's seed, these all apply to us. We are to learn lessons from their failures and their successes as well. Okay, so actually, before we get to the Judges, I think we'll talk about. Let's not skip over Moses. So we'll do one more reading from Exodus chapter 19. If someone would read Exodus 19 verses 5 and 6. Okay, back here.
Exodus 19, 5 and 6. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel.
Okay. So do you hear it again? Like, God has an emphasis that Israel is his treasure. They're his treasured possession. Here in verse 5, again, this is Exodus 19, so this is God speaking at the Exodus, at the time of Moses. He talks about Israel being his treasured possession among all peoples. He says, for all the earth is mine. So again, I want to point out there's a broader purpose for Israel that goes outside itself. He says, you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. What's a priest do? What's the role of a priest? A bridge builder, yeah. So a priest mediates between people and God. And who are the other people in this verse? The other people is not Israel. Israel is the priest. The other people is all the other nations. Israel is to be that bridge. They're to build a bridge between the other nations and Israel's God, the one true God. That's their purpose. So again, yes, God created Israel as a treasured possession, as a special people. But he created them for a purpose, for the benefit of the whole world. And again, I think this is why we learn from some of their failures, because they were not, as a people, living up to this purpose that God had for them. So how were the people of Israel ruled or governed during the Exodus times? Brother Walton?
During that time, excuse me, well, God was the governor, God was the leader, God was the king, and God worked through Moses to execute his plan. And he told Moses exactly what he needed to be saying to all the people.
Yes. I like what you said there. God was the king, right? God set up his kingdom. He was the king. He led them. Remember the pillar of cloud, the fire? God himself led them as their king. And he spoke to them. Well, at times he even spoke to them directly, but he spoke to them through Moses. He spoke to them through Moses and Aaron. And then during the conquest, we have a similar arrangement where Joshua is very much just kind of a general. He's not a king. He's not their judge. God is leading them. He's leading them in the conquest. God is leading them in the battle. But he's working through Joshua. So God speaks to them through Joshua and Eleazar. And then we get to Judges. And so once the people are settled in the land, God sets up this system of judges. And here we have sort of Deuteronomy lays out how that will work. It says, Deuteronomy 16, 18, and 19 says, you shall appoint for yourself judges and officers in all your towns, which the Lord your God is giving you, according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. You shall not distort justice. You shall not be partial. You shall not take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and perverts the words of the righteous. So God says, appoint judges and officers. And then there's standards for these officials. In fact, they have a high standard. They're there to have a standard of justice. And they're not to show partiality. They're to be impartial and to have justice and not take bribes and not be corrupt. But what do we know happened during the time of the judges? So every man did what? What was right in his own eyes, right? So that's the big lesson we learn from Judges. That's what happened. So we see that in Judges 17, verse 6. Every man did what was right in his own eyes, not God's eyes, not God's covenant. In other words, they're not fulfilling the purpose that God had for his people. So God dealt with this by raising up judges. We go through this period of many judges. So here was Moses and Joshua, and then we get to the time of the judges. And interspersed with these are periods of oppression, when things are rough for the children of Israel, for the people of Israel. There's Midianite oppression, Moabite oppression, Mesopotamian oppression, Ammonite oppression. And so we have this pattern of men doing what's right in their own eyes, God raising up a judge, God working through the judge to deal with the problem. And that brings us ultimately to, we'll talk about, so again, these are not my slides, these are Aaron's, but let's see, one more. Okay, yep. All right, so we learn some of the things we learned from Judges. We have this pattern where each generation seemingly has to learn the hard way, right? So Judges 2 tells us there arises another generation. They don't know the Lord or the work which he had done, which as you're just reading through Exodus, Joshua, and into Judges, it's seemingly hard to believe. How could you forget what the Lord has done for them? But with each generation, they start to serve themselves. They begin to turn to idolatry and devise their own religion. So in those days, there was no king in Israel. Every man did was right in his own eyes. Again, that's the theme that carries through Judges. But God sticks with them. So Judges 2:18, and when the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was the judge and delivered them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. But the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who were oppressed and afflicted them. So continually we see God is intervening. He's not leaving them to these oppressions. He's not leading them into exile yet, even though that's the ultimate outcome of the divided kingdom period, which we'll study. So then we get to the time of kings. So in 1 Samuel 8, we have the people, after this period of judges, they've now asked for a king. If I can get a volunteer to read 1 Samuel 8, 1 through 9. Oh, Jacob.
1 Samuel 8, 1 through 9. When Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. The names of his firstborn son was Joel, and the name of his second Abijah, and they were judges in Beersheba. Yet his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, and said to him, Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the other nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, Obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. According to all the deeds they have done from the day I brought them out of Egypt and even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are also doing to you. Now then, obey their voice, only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them.
All right, so the people have come to Samuel and they've asked for a king. Why do they want a king? Yes, to be like all the other nations. Was Israel supposed to be like all the other nations? Right there, right? Okay, that's problem number one. They were never supposed to be like all the other nations. They were supposed to be a nation of priests and a nation where God is the king. So did you catch that in verse 7? What God says to Samuel, he says, Samuel, they haven't rejected you. They haven't rejected the judges. They've rejected God. So they've rejected me from being king over them. So the arrangement was supposed to be God himself was their king. But they didn't want this. They wanted to be not a special people, not a treasured possession. They wanted to be like all the other nations. And so they demanded a king, which God conceded. He gives them a concession. He gives them a king. Samuel, of course, is not happy about this. If you stay in 1 Samuel 8, and Samuel tells them all the things, all the bad things that are going to come from having a king. And then if you look in verse 19 and 20, it says, so this is Samuel 8, 1 Samuel 8, 19 and 20. It says, but the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, but there shall be a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. Having just sort of read through the Gospels, this reminds me very much of Jesus' crucifixion and the crowd shouting, crucify him, and shouting, we have no king but Caesar. Right? The same attitude here. They look God in the face and they've said, no, you're not our king. We want a king. We want Caesar. We want a king like the people. We don't want God as our king. So you can feel I think you can feel the rejection in the text here, and Samuel feels it. But ultimately, they're rejecting God. They are rejecting God as their king. So God makes allowances for them to have a king. What were they looking for in a king? To do everything for them, right? So what kind of king do they expect? What are things they think a king should do? Fight our battles. Yeah, go out before us, right? Maybe they're looking for a warrior, right? And in fact, what kind of king do they get at the beginning? They get Saul. And what do we know about Saul? What's his stature like? Tall, yeah. So in 1 Samuel 10, when Saul becomes king, we have 1 Samuel 10, verses 22 through 24. It says, they inquired again of the Lord, is there a man still to come? And the Lord said, behold, he's hidden himself among the baggage. And then they ran and they took him from there. And when he stood among the people, he was taller than any of the people from his shoulders upward. And Samuel said to all the people, do you see him whom the Lord has chosen? There is none like him among all the people. And all the people shouted, long live the king. All right, so God gave them a king. He gave them a king of the type that they asked for. They wanted a king who could lead them out into battle. And so he gave them one that there was none like him among all Israel in terms of his stature. But now we should go back just a little bit to Samuel's warning. So if you look back at 1 Samuel 8, where we just were, in verses 10 through 18, Samuel warned them about all the horrible things that would happen if they took on a king like the other nations. He said, these kings, they're going to draft your sons to be soldiers. They're going to lead them out into battle. Your sons will die. They're going to take your daughters from you. They're going to take your daughters to work in their palaces. And they're going to impose taxes on you. And it's going to be harsh. The people didn't care. What they wanted was a king like all the other nations. But what they got is what Samuel warned them about. Now, I think it's worth looking at what did God intend for their king to be? Well, we know that God intended for himself to be their king, but if you look in Deuteronomy, God also anticipated a time when they would have kings. Before I get to that, Curtis, you have a comment?
I think it's kind of ironic that we find in the explanation that God tells Samuel to give to the people, he's not telling them about what the worst kings were going to do for them. He's talking about what the best kings would do. David, Solomon, these are people who make these demands of them. Acted for many years as if they had no central government. They lived in a tribal confederation, an amphictyony. And under those circumstances, God raised up for them the judge to be able to help them. They want a sitting government to be able to take care of all of those needs, and the government is going to cost them all these things that are described here, not to mention the kings that are going to turn them away from God. And I think that's ironic. When I used to read this, I'd think he's talking about the worst kings. He's talking about David. He's talking about Solomon.
That's a great point. Brother Daphne.
I think it's important to keep in mind while we go through this conversation that from day to day, as things transpire, the prophet, the representative of God, whoever we might be looking at, is surprised by the development of things. This or that happens, and it's a surprise for the man, it's a surprise for the people. That's their experience day after generation. It's not a surprise for God, because God is just having his plan unfold, and we're looking in on the microcosm of it day by day.
Great point. Really appreciate both your points. So this wasn't a surprise to God. In fact, when we look in Deuteronomy chapter 17, you look at Deuteronomy 17:14, God anticipates a time where they would have a king. And he says in verse 14 of chapter 17 in Deuteronomy, it says, when you come to the land that the Lord your God has given you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, you may indeed set a king over you whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brothers you will set as a king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. Only God has some rules for these kings. He says, he must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses. Since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. So God lays out these conditions. And as Brother Curtis was talking about, who is it but Solomon who violated each and every one of these things that God said a king shouldn't do? So even their best of kings didn't live up to the ideal that God had set for them. So moving on, we're going to fast forward just a bit to Solomon. We've got the kings here, so we go through David, Solomon. So we have Saul, David, Solomon. And then this is the period where we began the class with, where the kingdom divides. So things that are notable, things we all know well about Solomon. We know from 1 Kings 3, Solomon's prayer for wisdom, right? He prayed, God said he would give him anything, and he prayed for wisdom, and God rewarded him with great wisdom. We know that Solomon enlarged the kingdom to its greatest extent. We read that in 1 Kings 4. Israel itself, its boundaries were great. There was peace in the land. We also know that Solomon built the temple that David desired to build. But then seemingly, from the time he builds the temple, he begins making mistakes. Mistakes that ultimately will cause the kingdom to be torn from him. And again, this was all anticipated by God. God tells him in 1 Kings 9, he says, 1 Kings 9, verse 6, if you turn aside from following me, you or your children, and don't keep my commandments. Verse 7, he says, then I will cut off Israel from the land that I've given them. And I will cut them off from the house, that's the temple, that I have consecrated for my name. I will cast out of my sight. Israel will become a proverb. And this house, the temple, will become a heap of ruins. So while God has blessed Solomon with the building of the temple, he warns him that if you turn away, this house will ultimately become a heap of ruins. And that's where our story of the divided kingdom is going to end. It's going to end with the Babylonian captivity, with the destruction of the first temple. Because ultimately Solomon failed to keep the covenant. He acquired horses. You know, we're going to read that in these chapters right here following 1 Kings 9. He acquires many horses. In fact, He acquires horses and chariots, and he gets them from Egypt, and he sells them to other nations. He's in basically the weapons trade, trading horses and chariots with Egypt. He amasses great wealth, wealth beyond almost imagination. And he amasses, ultimately, seemingly his worst sin is the women, the number of wives. And it says it was they who turned his heart away from God. And so that's where we pick up where the divided kingdom begins, where we started here in First Kings chapter 11. So after this, we read about his great wealth. In chapter 10, we read about his wives, and then God, it says, punishes him, and he says he takes the kingdom out of his hands. We have a couple of minutes if anyone has comments or anything they'd like to say. Any comments on Solomon? Oh, in the back, Jeremiah, yes.
I had a comment not about Solomon, but about something earlier. In the time of the judges in 1 Samuel 4, verse 8, the Israelites fight the Philistines, and it's just something that I've noticed before, that the Philistines in 1 Samuel 4:8 are afraid because the Ark of the Covenant was brought into the camp of the Israelites, and they said that these are the gods who struck the Egyptians with all the plagues in the wilderness. They said, woe to us. So this was like 300 or 400 years after that had happened, but they're still really afraid because this was such a great thing that happened.
Yeah, that's a great comment. Any other comments real quick? Oh, one up here, if you can bring the mic up here to Mary. You may get there faster than me. I can read it. Hosea 13, 10 through 11. Where now is your king to save you in all your cities? Where are your rulers, those of whom you said, give me a king and princes? I gave you a king in my anger, and I took him away in my wrath. That's an apt verse for this. I'm very much looking forward to this quarter. I'm looking forward to spending the rest of it in these seats with you all. And